The sniper's bullet whistled past Corporal Sarah Mitchell's ear with a sound like death itself, close enough that she could feel the heat of its passage against her skin. She pressed herself deeper into the rocky outcropping, her M4 carbine clutched against her chest as chunks of granite exploded around her position. The metallic taste of fear filled her mouth, mixing with the dust and cordite that hung in the thin mountain air like a toxic fog. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 8,000 feet above sea level in the rugged peaks of eastern Afghanistan, Alpha Company had walked straight into a perfectly orchestrated ambush. What was supposed to be a routine patrol to investigate reports of insurgent activity had turned into a nightmare of crossfire and chaos. The enemy had chosen their killing ground well, a narrow valley with steep walls on both sides, limited cover, and only one way out. "Mitchell, where's my goddamn situation report?" Commander Jake Harrison's voice crackled through her radio with its usual edge of barely controlled impatience. Even now, with hostile fire raining down from 3 different positions, he managed to sound like she was personally responsible for ruining his day. Sarah wiped sweat and grit from her eyes, tasting popper where a rock fragment had split her lip. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning her body armor into a furnace that seemed determined to cook her alive from the inside out. "Multiple contacts on the ridgeline, sir. At least 10, maybe 12. They've got us boxed in down here like fish in a barrel." "I didn't ask for editorial commentary, Corporal. I asked for actionable intelligence." Harrison's response cut through the static with surgical precision. "Thompson and Garcia are moving up the north face. You take the south approach and try not to screw this up like you did during the Kandahar operation." The radio went silent, leaving Sarah alone with the echo of old wounds and newer fears. The Kandahar operation, 3 months ago, when she'd made a split-second decision that saved 4 lives but cost them their primary objective. Harrison had been there for the debriefing, had sat stone-faced while she explained her tactical reasoning, had nodded once, and made notes in that leather-bound journal he carried everywhere but never let anyone else read. Sarah. The voice belonged to Private First Class Danny Chen, her team's medic, and the only person in the unit who still looked at her like she might actually know what she was doing. He'd low-crawled up beside her while she'd been lost in Harrison's latest verbal assault, his young face streaked with camouflage paint and nervous sweat. "You okay?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. Chen had been with her squad for 4 months now, ever since she'd been transferred to Harrison's company after the Kandahar incident. He'd seen her work under fire, knew she could keep her head when the situation went sideways, but even he sometimes got that look, like he was waiting for her to prove Harrison right about her being unreliable. "Contact north." Sergeant Mike Thompson's voice exploded through the radio, followed immediately by the devastating chatter of automatic weapons fire. Sarah could see muzzle flashes winking like deadly fireflies along the ridge, and she knew without looking that Thompson and Garcia were pinned down just like everyone else. The insurgents had set this trap with military precision: high ground, interlocking fields of fire, multiple escape routes if things went bad for them. It was textbook guerrilla warfare, and Harrison's conventional assault tactics were about as effective as throwing rocks at a tank. Sarah closed her eyes for 3 seconds, letting her training override the chaos in her head. Count the firing positions, calculate range and wind direction, factor in the terrain advantages. When she opened them again, the pandemonium had organized itself into a tactical problem she could actually solve. "Chen, see that cluster of boulders at 11 o'clock, maybe 300 meters up?" She pointed to a spot where the enemy fire seemed most concentrated. "I count at least 4 shooters, maybe 5. That's their command position, and they're calling the shots for the whole ambush." Chen adjusted his binoculars, studying the target through the heat shimmer. "Yeah, I see them. But Sarah, that's a hell of a difficult shot. Extreme uphill angle, crosswind, and they're dug in behind serious cover." "I can make it." She was already adjusting her scope, calculating windage and elevation with the methodical precision that had made her one of the best marksmen in the battalion. "But I need you to spot me, and I need Harrison to understand that we're not taking that position by charging uphill like we're storming Normandy Beach." Chen keyed his radio. "Command, this is Chen. Mitchell has eyes on the primary threat, requesting permission to engage from my current position." Harrison's response came back sharp and immediate. "Negative. I want boots on that ridge, not long-range pot shots. Mitchell, you will advance with Thompson and Garcia. Chen, you provide medical support from Overwatch." Sarah felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach. It was exactly the kind of plan that looked decisive on paper, but got good soldiers killed in practice. Harrison was more interested in demonstrating his authority than adapting to the tactical reality they were facing. "Sir, respectfully, I think I can be more effective from—" "Did I ask what you think, Corporal?" Harrison's voice could etch glass. "This is not a democracy, and your job is not to think strategically. Your job is to follow orders and execute the mission as briefed." Sarah stared at her radio for a long moment, then looked at Chen. He was watching her with an expression she'd seen too many times before, part sympathy, part resignation. They both knew Harrison was wrong, but they also understood what happened to soldiers who made too much of a habit of questioning orders from superior officers. "Acknowledged, sir." Sarah shouldered her rifle and started moving toward the north face where Thompson and Garcia were supposed to be advancing. Every step felt like walking toward her own execution, but she'd been following questionable orders long enough to know that the alternative was usually court-martial. Sergeant Thompson looked up as she approached, his weathered face grim with the knowledge of what they were being asked to do. Mike Thompson was 28 years old, from a small farming town in Iowa, with a wife and twin boys who sent him crayon drawings that he kept folded in his helmet liner. He'd joined the army to escape a cycle of poverty that had trapped his family for 3 generations, and he'd ended up in the mountains of Afghanistan because someone in Washington had decided that democracy needed to be exported at gunpoint. "Hell of a thing, isn't it, Mitchell?" He gestured toward the ridge where the enemy positions continued to spit fire like angry hornets. "Harrison wants us to assault prepared positions uphill against superior numbers. What could possibly go wrong?" "Orders are orders," Sarah said, but she could hear the doubt creeping into her own voice. She looked around for Garcia and found him 20 feet away, checking his ammunition with the mechanical movements of someone trying not to think about what came next. Specialist Luis Garcia was barely 21, fresh-faced and eager, with the kind of optimism that hadn't yet been ground down by the reality of asymmetric warfare. He'd grown up in East Los Angeles, where joining the military had seemed like the only path out of a neighborhood where too many of his friends had ended up dead or in prison before their 21st birthdays. "Garcia, are you ready for this?" Sarah called out. He looked up with eyes that seemed too young for his face, too innocent for the situation they were facing. "Yeah, Corporal. I mean, it's pretty intense, you know? They've got all the advantages up there. High ground, cover, prepared positions. We're supposed to just run up there and hope for the best?" "We're supposed to be professional soldiers," Sarah said, but her heart wasn't in the right place. Garcia was right to be scared. They all were. Harrison's voice crackled over the radio again. "All units, this is the command. We advance in 90 seconds. Thompson, you take the center approach. Garcia, you're with me on the right flank. Mitchell, I want you on the left side. Chen will coordinate medical support from the rear." Sarah checked her rifle one more time, then looked up at the ridge where death was waiting among the rocks like a patient predator. She thought about her younger sister back in Oregon, who'd begged her not to re-enlist after her first deployment. She thought about her mother, who still lit candles at St. Patrick's Cathedral every Sunday, praying for her daughter's safe return from a war she didn't understand. Most of all, she thought about Kandahar, about the moment when she'd had to choose between following orders and keeping her people alive. Harrison had never forgiven her for making the tactically sound decision instead of the politically expedient one. 60 seconds, Harrison announced, and Sarah could hear the anticipation building in his voice. Some commanders led from the front because duty demanded it. Harrison led from the front because he genuinely enjoyed the adrenaline rush, the chaos, the opportunity to prove his tactical superiority even when his tactics were fundamentally flawed. Sarah took a deep breath and started counting down in her head. 59, 58, 57. She could see Thompson crossing himself and muttering what looked like a prayer for his family back in Iowa. Garcia was hyperventilating, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps that fogged his rifle scope. Chen's voice came through on the radio, calm and professional despite the circumstances. Overwatch in position. I have clear lines of sight on multiple hostile positions. Sarah, he paused, and she could hear the concern bleeding through his professional composure. Be smart out there. 30 seconds. Sarah thought about the letter she'd written to her mother but never sent, the one that tried to explain why she kept volunteering for deployments to places like this, why she couldn't seem to find her way back to a world where people worried about mortgage payments and traffic jams instead of wondering whether today would be the day they didn't come home. 20 seconds. She could hear Harrison breathing heavily over the radio, could picture him crouched behind his cover with that expression he always wore before a firefight, the look of someone who was about to prove something important to someone who mattered, even if it killed everyone else in the process. 10 seconds. Sarah closed her eyes and said a silent prayer to whatever divine authority might be listening in this God-forsaken corner of the world. Keep Thompson alive for his sons. Keep Garcia alive for his future. Keep Chen alive because he's the best medic I've ever served with. And if someone has to die today, let it be quick, and let it mean something. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. 5 seconds. Sarah could feel her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. Execute! 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 Harrison's voice cut through the mountain air like a blade. Sarah burst from cover and started running uphill, her boots slipping on loose shale, her rifle at the ready, her entire world suddenly reduced to the simple mathematics of survival. She could hear Thompson and Garcia moving to her right, could hear Harrison shouting something that might have been encouragement or tactical guidance. It was impossible to tell over the immediate roar of enemy fire that erupted from every position on the ridge. The world exploded into chaos and violence. Bullets snapped past her head like invisible whips, chipping sparks from the rocks around her feet, tugging at her uniform with the persistence of grasping fingers. She dove behind a boulder just as something heavy impacted the ground where she'd been standing, sending up a shower of dirt and stone fragments that rattled against her helmet like deadly hail. This was it. This was where good soldiers died because someone in command had confused boldness with wisdom, where tactical brilliance met bureaucratic stubbornness, and the soldiers paid the price in blood. The ambush unfolded with devastating precision. Within seconds of Harrison's order to advance, the mountainside erupted in a symphony of automatic weapons fire that turned the narrow valley into a killing field. Sarah pressed herself against the boulder, feeling the vibrations of incoming rounds as they shattered against the granite just inches from her head. "Contact left! Contact left!" Thompson's voice screamed through the radio, followed by the distinctive crack of his M4 rifle returning fire. But Sarah could already see the tactical situation deteriorating beyond recovery. The insurgents had prepared this ambush with professional skill, and Harrison's frontal assault was playing directly into their hands. "Garcia, report." Harrison's voice cut through the chaos, tight with the kind of urgency that meant the plan was falling apart faster than anyone had anticipated. Silence. "Garcia, goddammit, answer me!" Sarah risked a quick look around her cover and felt her blood turn to ice. Garcia was down, maybe 40 feet away, his rifle lying in the dirt beside him. He wasn't moving, but she could see his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. Hit, but alive, for now. The enemy fire was intensifying, coordinated volleys that spoke of military training and careful preparation. These weren't the untrained farmers and ideological zealots that intelligence briefings like to portray. These were professional fighters who understood terrain, timing, and the psychological impact of well-executed violence. Chen, can you see Garcia? Sarah keyed her radio while keeping low behind the boulder. Affirmative, I see him. Chen's voice was steady, but she could hear the stress underneath. Looks like he took one in the shoulder, maybe the chest. There's a lot of blood, Sarah. He needs immediate medical attention. Sarah studied the tactical situation with growing dread. Garcia was lying in open ground between her position and Thompson, completely exposed to enemy fire from at least 3 different directions. Any attempt to reach him would mean crossing a kill zone where the insurgents had perfect fields of fire and all the time in the world to aim. Command, we need to fall back, Sarah said into her radio, knowing even as she spoke that Harrison wouldn't listen. Negative, Harrison's response came back immediately. We finished this mission. The insurgents think they can ambush American forces and walk away? They're about to learn otherwise. Sarah watched in horror as Thompson started moving toward Garcia's position, using every scrap of cover available while bullets kicked up dirt all around him. The sergeant was brave, stupidly, heroically brave, but courage wouldn't stop a sniper's bullet or defeat the mathematics of superior positioning. Thompson, stop, Sarah keyed her radio frantically. That's a kill zone. You move into that open ground and you're dead. Can't leave him, Thompson's voice came back, distorted by static and the sound of nearby explosions. I can reach him if you can keep their heads down. Sarah brought her rifle to bear on the ridge and started laying down suppressing fire, trying to force the enemy shooters to take cover long enough for Thompson to reach Garcia. She could see Chen doing the same from his overwatch position, his precise shots methodically targeting the most dangerous firing positions. But there were too many of them, and they had every advantage. Dovetail made it halfway to Garcia before the shot rang out. Sarah watched the Iowa farm boy pitch forward and lie still, and something inside her chest shattered like glass. 2 down. 2 good soldiers down because Jake Harrison was too proud to admit tactical reality. Thompson, Harrison's voice over the radio, and for the first time since she'd known him, he sounded genuinely shaken. Thompson, respond. Silence. Sarah stared at the 2 bodies lying in the Afghan dirt, Garcia still breathing, Thompson motionless, and felt a familiar sensation wash over her. It was the same feeling she'd experienced in Kandahar when she'd realized that following orders was going to get people killed, and the only way to save them was to stop being a good soldier and start being a good person. The weight of that decision had haunted her for 3 months. Now she was facing it again, but this time the stakes were even higher. Chen, she said quietly into her radio, how many rounds do you have left? 18, came the immediate response. Why? Because I'm going after them. I was already checking her gear, redistributing ammunition, preparing for what I knew was essentially a suicide mission. Sarah, no. Chen's voice was sharp with alarm. That's insane. Even if you reach them, you'll never make it back. The insurgents have that entire area zeroed in. Sarah looked up at the ridge where muzzle flashes continued to wink like deadly stars, then back at Garcia, who was trying to drag himself toward cover while leaving a trail of blood in the sand. She thought about Thompson, who died trying to save his teammate. She thought about Harrison, safe behind his rocks, giving orders that got 21-year-olds killed. She turned off her radio. Sarah Mitchell had been carrying other people's burdens since she was 7 years old. It started the day her father walked out of their small house in Bend, Oregon, leaving behind nothing but empty whiskey bottles and a mother who cried herself to sleep for 6 months straight. Sarah became the one who made sure her little sister ate breakfast before school, who helped with homework when their mother was working double shifts at the diner, who learned to forge parent signatures on permission slips because there was no one else to do it. By the time she was 15, she was working 20 hours a week at a local grocery store, her paycheck going straight into the family account to keep the electricity turned on. Her guidance counselor, Mrs. Peterson, used to stay after school to help her with college applications, understanding that Sarah's academic potential was being buried under the weight of premature responsibility. She'd learned to carry the weight of adult problems while other kids her age worried about prom dates and football games. The Army recruiter who visited her high school during senior year had seemed like a messenger from another world, a world where responsibility came with structure, purpose, and the promise of college money she could never have earned otherwise. What the recruiter hadn't mentioned was that the Army would take someone who already knew how to carry everyone else's problems and teach her to carry them with lethal precision. Sarah had excelled in basic training, not because she was naturally gifted at military discipline, but because she already understood that sometimes you had to do things you didn't want to do for people who depended on you. She'd scored expert on every weapon system they'd given her, earned commendations for leadership under stress, and graduated at the top of her advanced individual training class. Her first deployment to Iraq had been a revelation. For the first time in her life, the weight she was carrying felt meaningful, connected to something larger than family dysfunction and economic desperation. She was protecting people, serving her country, making a difference in a world that seemed determined to tear itself apart. The problem was that military service came with people like Jake Harrison. Sarah had first encountered Harrison 8 months ago when she'd been transferred to his company after the Kandahar incident. He was an Annapolis graduate, the son of a retired Marine colonel, the kind of officer who'd been groomed for command since childhood. He was also 34 years old, recently divorced, and absolutely convinced that warfare was a mathematical equation where human variables could be controlled through superior training and decisive leadership. Their first meeting had been in his office at Forward Operating Base Chapman, a sterile concrete room decorated with tactical maps and a photograph of Harrison receiving some award from a general whose name Sarah didn't recognize. Harrison had sat behind his desk reading her service record while she stood at attention, feeling like a specimen being examined under a microscope. "Iraq, Afghanistan," he'd said without looking up. "2 deployments, Bronze Star, Army Commendation Medal with V device. Impressive record for someone so young." "Thank you, sir." Impressive, but problematic. Harrison had finally looked up, his cold green eyes calculating and judgmental. "Tell me about the convoy incident in Kandahar." And there it was, the moment Sarah had been dreading since receiving her transfer orders. Every officer in the battalion knew about Kandahar, but most of them understood that combat situations are fluid, complex, and often required split-second decisions that look different in after-action reports than they did in the moment. Harrison, apparently, was not most officers. "Sir, my report covers the tactical situation and the decisions I made based on available intelligence. I'm not asking about your report, Corporal. I'm asking about your judgment." Harrison had leaned back in his chair, studying her like she was a puzzle he needed to solve. "You were ordered to maintain overwatch on the convoy route. Instead, you abandoned your position to provide close support when the lead vehicle hit an IED." Sarah had felt her jaw clench involuntarily. "Sir, the convoy was taking heavy fire from multiple directions. My position allowed me to eliminate 3 insurgent fighters who were flanking. Your position allowed you to disobey direct orders from your platoon leader. 2 insurgents escaped during the confusion, and it took an additional 4 hours to secure the area because you decided you knew better than your commanding officer." The accusation had hit Sarah like a physical blow. Yes, she'd left her assigned position. Yes, she'd acted without explicit orders, but her decision had saved the lives of at least 6 soldiers, including the convoy commander who'd been pinned down by accurate sniper fire. "Sir, with respect, if I'd stayed in an overwatch position, we'd have lost half the convoy. The insurgents had established a coordinated ambush, and the original plan was developed by officers with years of tactical experience and access to intelligence you didn't have. Your job, Corporal Mitchell, is not to second-guess strategic decisions. Your job is to follow orders and trust that your superiors understand the bigger picture." That conversation had set the tone for their relationship over the past 8 months. Harrison had been testing her ever since, assigning her to the most dangerous patrols, the most challenging leadership positions, the kind of missions that were technically within regulations but clearly designed to prove some kind of point about subordination and military discipline. Sarah had endured it all without complaint because that's what professional soldiers did. She'd kept her opinions to herself during tactical briefings, had followed orders she privately disagreed with, had played by Harrison's rules because she still believed that competence and dedication would eventually speak for themselves. She'd been wrong. The breaking point had come 2 weeks ago during a training exercise in the mountains. Harrison had designed a scenario that required her squad to clear a series of fortified positions with minimal air support and no artillery backup. It was the kind of mission that looked impressive in PowerPoint presentations but would be catastrophic in actual combat. "Sir, with respect," Sarah had said during the mission briefing, pointing to the terrain model spread across the table, "this approach is going to result in significant casualties. The enemy positions have interlocking fields of fire, excellent cover, and multiple escape routes. If we want to neutralize these positions effectively, we need—" "What we need," Harrison had interrupted, "is for corporals to execute orders instead of playing armchair generals. Are you questioning my tactical assessment, Mitchell?" Sarah had looked around the room at the other squad leaders. Thompson, Garcia's team leader Sergeant Adams, Chen, who was watching the exchange with barely concealed concern. They all knew she was right, but they also understood that challenging Harrison publicly was career suicide. "No, sir," she'd said finally, "just ensuring we've considered all available options." Harrison had smiled that cold smile. "The only option you need to consider is following orders. Unless you don't think you're capable of that." "I'm capable, sir." "Good. Because I've been watching you, Mitchell, and I'm starting to wonder if you might be the weak link in this unit. A soldier who can't follow orders is a soldier who can't be trusted. And a soldier who can't trusted—" He'd left the sentence hanging, but the implication was crystal clear. Sarah had spent that night lying on her cot, staring at the ceiling of the barracks and wondering if Harrison was right. Maybe she was the problem. Maybe her tendency to question orders, to look for better solutions, to prioritize soldier welfare over blind obedience really did make her unsuitable for military service. But then she'd thought about the convoy in Kandahar, about the soldiers whose lives she'd saved by acting on tactical instinct rather than rigid adherence to flawed orders. She'd thought about all the young soldiers who looked to her for guidance, who trusted her to make the right decisions when the situation went sideways. Most importantly, she'd thought about Thompson and Garcia and Chen, good soldiers who deserved leaders who cared more about their survival than about proving points to superior officers. If Jake Harrison thought she was going to let them die to demonstrate some abstract principle about military hierarchy, he was about to discover exactly how wrong he could be. Now, lying behind a boulder with enemy fire whining overhead and 2 of her soldiers bleeding in the dirt 30 feet away, that resolve felt both comforting and terrifying. She was about to commit an act of direct insubordination that would end her military career and possibly land her in prison. She was also about to do the only thing that had any chance of keeping Garcia and Thompson alive. Sarah closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and started crawling toward the killing field where her teammates lay wounded and exposed. Every instinct screamed at her to stay in cover, to wait for backup, to follow protocol and let someone else make the hard decisions. But Sarah Mitchell had been making hard decisions for other people since she was 7 years old. She wasn't about to stop now. The first 15 yards across open ground felt like crawling through liquid fire. Sarah kept her body pressed against the rocky terrain, using every depression and boulder for cover while bullets from the ridge above carved the air inches from her head. The sound was like angry wasps, a constant buzz of death that seemed to follow her every movement. Chen's rifle cracked steadily from his overwatch position, each shot calculated to force the insurgents into cover for precious seconds. But there were at least 8 enemy fighters on the ridge, and even Chen's exceptional marksmanship couldn't suppress them all simultaneously. Garcia was closer, maybe 20 feet ahead. As Sarah crawled nearer, she could see that he was conscious but fading fast. His left shoulder was torn open by what looked like a rifle round, and there was another wound in his side that was bleeding steadily through his uniform. When he saw her approaching, he tried to speak, but only managed a weak cough that brought up blood. "Hey, Garcia," Sarah whispered as she reached his position. "Looks like you found some trouble." "Corporal," Garcia's voice was barely audible over the gunfire. "I can't. My arm." Sarah did a quick assessment while keeping one eye on the ridge above. The shoulder wound was serious but not immediately life-threatening. The side wound was more concerning. It looked like the bullet had caught him just below his body armor, possibly nicking internal organs. He was losing blood faster than she'd initially thought. "You're going to be fine," she said, pulling field dressings from her kit. The real problem wasn't Garcia's wounds. It was their position. They were lying in the middle of a natural amphitheater, completely exposed to enemy fire from 3 different directions. Every second they remained here increased the chances that an insurgent sniper would get lucky. "Thompson," Garcia grabbed her arm with his good hand. "Is Thompson okay? I saw him go down." Sarah looked towards where Thompson lay motionless 15 feet away. From this angle, she could see the dark stain spreading beneath his head, the unnatural stillness that spoke of injuries beyond medical intervention. She'd seen enough combat casualties to recognize the difference between wounded and dead. "Let me worry about Thompson," she said gently, pressing the dressing against Garcia's side wound. "Right now, I need you to focus on staying conscious. Your mom is waiting for you back in Los Angeles, and she's going to want to hear all about your adventures in Afghanistan." Garcia nodded weakly, his face gray with shock and blood loss. Sarah knew she had to move fast. Every minute they stayed in this position was another minute for the insurgents to coordinate their fire, to bring up additional weapons, to turn this rescue attempt into a double fatality. "Chen," she whispered into her radio, hoping Harrison wasn't monitoring this frequency. "I've got Garcia. He's hit bad but stable. Thompson," she paused, looking at the motionless figure. "Thompson is KIA." Chen's response came back tight with controlled emotion. "Copy that, Sarah, but you need to get out of there now. I'm seeing movement on the ridge, and I think they're repositioning for a better shot." Sarah looked up at the rocky slope above them, where she could make out the shapes of enemy fighters moving among the boulders with the deliberate patience of hunters who knew their prey was trapped. Chen was right. They were being maneuvered into an even worse position. "I'm going to need you to keep their heads down for about 30 seconds. Can you do that? Sarah, what are you planning?" 30 seconds, Chen. That's all I need." Sarah didn't wait for his response. She grabbed Garcia under the arms and started dragging him toward the nearest cover, a cluster of rocks about 15 yards away. Garcia weighed at least 160 pounds, and the rocky terrain made every step treacherous, but Sarah had been carrying heavy loads her entire life. Chen's rifle opened up from the overwatch position, laying down a steady stream of precision fire that forced the insurgent snipers to duck for cover. Sarah used those crucial seconds to haul Garcia across the killing field, her boots slipping on loose shale, her back screaming with the effort of dragging a wounded man while wearing 60 pounds of gear. They made it to cover just as the enemy fire resumed, bullets chipping sparks from the rocks around them. Garcia was barely conscious now, his breathing shallow and rapid, his face the color of old concrete. Sarah knew he was going into shock, knew that without immediate medical evacuation, he wasn't going to survive much longer. And Thompson was already dead, lying alone in the Afghan dirt while his wife and twin sons back in Iowa waiting for news that would destroy their world. Harrison's voice exploded through Sarah's radio with the force of barely controlled fury. "Mitchell, what the hell is your status? I've been trying to reach you for 15 minutes." Sarah looked down at Garcia, who was drifting in and out of consciousness, his breathing becoming more labored with each passing minute. She looked across the open ground toward Thompson's motionless form. Then she looked up at the ridge where muzzle flashes continued to wink like deadly stars. She thought about Harrison, safe behind his cover 70 yards away, demanding situation reports while good soldiers died following his flawed tactical plan. She turned her radio back on. "Garcia is wounded but stable," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Thompson is KIA. I need immediate medical evacuation." "I don't need casualty reports, Mitchell. I need you to follow orders." Harrison's voice carried the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "The insurgents are still holding those ridge positions, and we're not leaving until we've neutralized the threat." Sarah felt something cold and dangerous unfurl in her chest. "Sir, we have casualties that require immediate—" "We have a mission to complete," Harrison cut her off. "The enemy thinks they can ambush American forces and walk away. Chen, what's your ammunition status?" Chen's voice came back reluctant. "Down to 12 rounds, sir." Then make them count. Mitchell, I want you to continue the advance. Use Garcia's position as a base of fire." "Garcia is bleeding out," Sarah interrupted, her professional composure finally beginning to crack. "He needs a medevac, not a tactical discussion. Garcia is a soldier, and soldiers accept risk. Now follow my orders or—" Sarah turned off her radio again. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant crack of enemy fire and Garcia's labored breathing. She knew she'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had committed an act of insubordination that would end her career and probably land her in military prison. She also knew she didn't care. "Corporal?" Garcia's voice was barely a whisper. "What's happening?" Sarah checked his dressing, noting that the bleeding had slowed but not stopped. His pulse was rapid and thready, his skin clammy with shock. Without proper medical attention, he had maybe 40 minutes before blood loss became critical. "Nothing you need to worry about," she said, trying to keep her voice calm and reassuring. "I'm going to get you out of here, okay? But I need you to stay with me. Keep talking." "My mother," Garcia mumbled, his eyes unfocused. "She doesn't know I'm here, doesn't know I deployed. I told her I was stationed in Germany, doing training exercises. Didn't want her to worry." Sarah felt her throat tighten. Maria Garcia, 53 years old, working 2 jobs to support her youngest son's dreams of college and citizenship. Now she's waiting for letters from Germany, while her boy bleeds in the mountains of Afghanistan. "She's going to be fine," Sarah said firmly. "You're going to be fine. Both of you are going home." Chen's voice crackled through on her radio, transmitted on a frequency Harrison didn't monitor. "Sarah, I've been watching the insurgent positions. They're starting to move down from the ridge. I think they're planning to finish this up close and personal." Sarah risked a look around their cover and saw what Chen meant. Dark figures were moving among the rocks, working their way down the slope with the patient deliberation of hunters who knew their prey was wounded and trapped. In another 10 minutes, maybe 15, they'd be close enough to use grenades or simply overwhelm Sarah's position through superior numbers. "How many?" she asked. "At least 6, maybe 8. And, Sarah?" Chen paused. "I think they've got Harrison's position marked too. He's about to have company too." Sarah looked toward where Harrison was positioned, a cluster of boulders about 80 yards away. She could see the muzzle flash of his rifle as he fired at targets on the ridge, could imagine him crouched behind his rocks with that expression of grim determination he always wore during firefights. For all his faults as a leader, Jake Harrison was a competent soldier and a brave man. He was also about to die because he was too proud to admit when a tactical situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. Sarah made her 4th irreversible decision of the day. "Chen, I need you to do something for me," she said into her radio, "and you're going to think I'm crazy." More crazy than usual? Despite everything, Sarah found herself smiling. Danny Chen had been her anchor through 8 months of impossible leadership, the voice of reason when military hierarchy collided with tactical reality. If she was about to throw away her career, at least she was doing it for people who mattered. "I need you to put a covering fire on that slope," she said. "Everything you've got. Don't worry about conserving ammunition." "Sarah, I've only got 10 rounds left. After that, you're going to pack up your gear and start moving toward the extraction point," Sarah interrupted. "And you're going to take Garcia with you." There was a long pause. What about Harrison? Sarah looked across the rocky ground toward Harrison's position, where enemy fighters were now moving with increasing boldness. She thought about his cold green eyes, his cutting remarks, his absolute certainty that following orders mattered more than keeping soldiers alive. She thought about Garcia lying wounded because Harrison had refused to listen to tactical advice. She thought about Thompson lying dead because Harrison had insisted on a frontal assault against prepared positions. Then she thought about Maria Garcia waiting at home with letters addressed to a son she thought was safe in Germany. She thought about Harrison's parents, whoever they were, waiting for their son to come home from his war. She thought about the fundamental truth that had guided her through 2 deployments and 8 months of questionable leadership. Everyone goes home, or no one does. "I'll get Harrison," she said. Chen's response was immediate and sharp. Sarah, no, that's suicide. You can't carry Garcia and fight your way to Harrison's position. And you sure as hell can't fight through 8 insurgent fighters with a rifle and determination. Sarah was already moving, checking her remaining ammunition while keeping the rocks between herself and the enemy positions. Garcia is your responsibility now. Get him to the extraction point and make sure his mother gets to hug her son again. Sarah, that's an order, Corporal. Sarah's voice carried the kind of authority that came from 5 years of leading soldiers through impossible situations. And Chen, when you write the report, make sure they know Thompson died trying to save his teammate. That matters. Sarah could hear Chen cursing over the radio, but she also heard him starting to move, beginning the process of preparing Garcia for extraction. Good. At least some of them were going to make it home. Garcia was semi-conscious when Sarah reached him, his eyes fluttering open as she checked his dressing one more time. The bleeding had mostly stopped, but his color was terrible and his breathing was getting worse. Shock was setting in hard, and without immediate medical attention, he wasn't going to last much longer. Garcia, listen to me, Sarah said urgently. Chen is going to get you out of here. I need you to do exactly what he tells you, okay? No heroics, no trying to help. Just focus on getting home to your mother. Garcia's eyes focused on her with surprising clarity. What about you, Corporal? What about Harrison? Sarah looked across the battlefield toward Harrison's position, where she could see enemy fighters moving closer with each passing minute. The smart thing to do would be to follow Chen and Garcia, to extract while they still could, and let Harrison deal with the consequences of his own poor leadership. It would be tactically sound, militarily justified, and probably what any reasonable person would do. But Sarah Mitchell had never been particularly reasonable. Harrison's my responsibility, she said simply. The same way you and Thompson were my responsibility. The same way Chen is Chen's responsibility now. Garcia grabbed her arm with what little strength he had left. Sarah, don't do this. That man has done nothing but make your life hell for 8 months. He called you the weak link. He got Thompson killed with his stubborn pride. Let him figure his own way out. For a moment, Sarah wavered. Garcia was right. Harrison had made her life miserable, had questioned her competence, had ignored her tactical advice, and gotten good soldiers killed as a result. She owed him nothing, except the minimum courtesy required by military protocol. But that wasn't how Sarah Mitchell had been raised. Her mother had taught her that you help people not because they deserve it, but because helping people is what decent human beings do. Her absent father had taught her through his abandonment that running away from responsibility was easy, but it poisoned everything it touched. The army had taught her that leaders eat last, that the mission comes first, but soldiers never come second, and that sometimes being a good person meant being a bad soldier. Take care of yourself, Garcia, Sarah said, squeezing his shoulder. Give your mother my love. She was already moving before he could respond, using every scrap of cover to work her way toward Harrison's position. Chen's rifle cracked from his overwatch position, laying down precise covering fire that forced the advancing insurgent fighters to duck and weave among the rocks. Sarah used those precious seconds to cover ground, her body low, her rifle ready, her mind focused on the simple mathematics of tactical movement. 80 yards to Harrison's position, at least 6 enemy fighters converging from multiple directions. Unknown ammunition status for Harrison, no air support, no artillery, no backup coming over the hill with cavalry charges and dramatic music. Just Sarah Mitchell, a rifle, and the stubborn refusal to let another soldier die on her watch. She was halfway to Harrison's position when the first grenade exploded. The grenade blast lifted Sarah off her feet and threw her against a jagged boulder with enough force to drive the air from her lungs. The world became a spinning kaleidoscope of dust, smoke, and ringing silence that seemed to muffle everything except the hammering of her own heart. She tasted blood, felt the warm trickle down her forehead where shrapnel had opened a gash just above her left eyebrow. Through the settling dust, she could see Harrison's position had taken a direct hit. The carefully arranged rocks that had provided his cover were now scattered like a child's building blocks, and she could make out his motionless form among the debris, his rifle thrown several yards away, his uniform torn and bloody. The insurgent fighters were closing in for the kill. Sarah didn't think about the tactical impossibility of what she was attempting. She didn't calculate the odds or consider the strategic implications of her actions. She simply rolled to her feet, shouldered her rifle, and started running toward Harrison's position while laying down suppressing fire on anything that moved. The world exploded around her in a symphony of violence that seemed designed specifically to end her life. Bullets snapped past her head like invisible whips, chipped concrete-sized chunks from the rocks at her feet, tugged at her gear with the persistence of grasping hands. She could hear shouting in Pashto, could see muzzle flashes winking at her from multiple positions, could taste the metallic flavor of adrenaline mixed with the certainty that she was about to die. But Sarah kept running. She reached Harrison's position in what felt like hours, but was probably less than 20 seconds. Harrison was unconscious but breathing, a nasty head wound bleeding freely, his left leg bent at an angle that suggested either a bad break or dislocated knee. He was alive, but he wasn't going anywhere under his own power. "Harrison," Sarah shook his shoulder urgently. "Sir, I need you to wake up. We need to move now." Harrison's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. "Mitchell? What? Where am I?" "You're about 15 seconds away from being dead if you don't listen to me," Sarah said bluntly while checking his wounds. "I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to help me however you can. Can you move your arms?" Harrison tried to sit up and immediately fell back with a grunt of pain. "My leg, I think it's broken. Mitchell, what's the tactical situation?" Even semi-conscious and bleeding, Jake Harrison was asking about the tactical situation. Sarah might have laughed if bullets weren't still flying over their heads and insurgent fighters weren't closing in from 3 directions. "The tactical situation is that we're outnumbered, outgunned, and about to be overrun," Sarah said, while fashioning a makeshift stretcher from Harrison's poncho and 2 broken pieces of his rifle stock. "Garcia is wounded, but Chen is getting him to the extraction point. Thompson is KIA. Any other questions, or can we focus on not dying?" Harrison stared at her with an expression she'd never seen before, something that might have been respect, or surprise, or simple shock at finding himself rescued by the soldier he'd spent 8 months calling unreliable. "You came back for me," he said, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. "I came back because that's what soldiers do," Sarah said, loading Harrison onto the improvised stretcher as gently as possible. "We don't leave people behind, even when they're complete idiots who've spent the last 8 months making our lives miserable." "Mitchell." "Save it, sir," Sarah finished securing Harrison to the stretcher and grabbed the handles. "You can court-martial me when we get home. Right now, I need you to keep pressure on that head wound and try that to bleed to death while I figure out how to get us off this mountain." Harrison pressed his head against the wound on his forehead, his face gray with pain and shock. "How many insurgent fighters?" "At least 6, maybe more. They're moving to surround this position, and I've got maybe 60 rounds left." Sarah shouldered her rifle and prepared to move. "So, if you've got any brilliant tactical insights, now would be a good time to share them." Harrison looked around at the rocky terrain, assessing angles and cover with the professional eye of a trained officer. Despite his injuries, despite the desperate nature of their situation, his mind was still working tactically. "There," he pointed toward a narrow ravine that cut through the rocks about 60 yards away. "If we can reach that gully, it should provide concealment most of the way to the extraction point. But Mitchell," he looked up at her with those green eyes that seemed less cold now, more human. "You'll never make it carrying me. This stretcher will slow you down too much, and they'll run us down before we cover 50 yards." Sarah adjusted her grip on the stretcher handles and started moving toward the ravine. "Then I guess we'd better move fast." What followed was the longest 60 yards of Sarah's life. Dragging a 180-pound man across broken terrain while insurgent fighters closing in from 3 directions was like trying to outrun an avalanche while carrying a piano. Every step was agony, every rock and depression a major obstacle, every second an eternity measured in the space between heartbeats. Harrison did what he could to help, using his arms to push when the terrain allowed, keeping watch for enemy movement when Sarah was focused on navigation. But his broken leg made him dead weight most of the time, and Sarah could feel her strength ebbing with each painful yard. The insurgent fighters were getting closer. She could hear them calling to each other in their native language, could see movement among the rocks, could feel the net closing around them with methodical precision. In another few minutes, they'd be close enough to finish this with a well-placed shot or a coordinated assault. Sarah kept pulling. They were 30 yards from the ravine when the shooting started in earnest. Bullets cracked past her head, chipped sparks from the rocks around them, forced her to drop the stretcher and dive for cover behind a boulder barely large enough to shelter 1 person, let alone 2. "Contact right," Harrison shouted, pointing toward a cluster of rocks where Sarah could see muzzle flashes. At least 4 shooters. Sarah brought her rifle to bear and started returning fire, trying to keep the insurgents' heads down while she figured out their next move. They were pinned down, running low on ammunition, and still 30 yards from the only cover that might get them to the extraction point alive. "Harrison, how's your head? Can you think straight?" "Clear enough. Why?" Sarah ejected her empty magazine and slammed in a fresh one, her last. "Because I'm going to need you to cover me while I move us to that ravine. Can you handle a rifle with that head injury?" Harrison looked at her like she'd lost his mind. "Mitchell, you can't drag me 30 yards across open ground while taking fire. That's suicide." Sarah smiled grimly. "Sir, with all due respect, I've been doing impossible things my entire life. This is just another day at the office." Before Harrison could object, Sarah was moving again, dragging the stretcher toward the ravine while bullets whined around them like angry hornets. Harrison, to his credit, managed to lay down covering fire despite his injuries, his shots forcing the insurgent fighters to duck for cover at crucial moments. But the enemy was adapting, coordinating their fire, using superior numbers to maintain constant pressure. Sarah could see more fighters moving down from the ridge, could hear the distinctive sound of an AK-47 being reloaded somewhere close behind them. They weren't going to make it. Sarah had covered maybe 15 yards when she felt the bullet catch her in the right shoulder, spinning her around and sending her sprawling beside the stretcher. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, like someone had driven a red-hot poker through her deltoid muscle. Her rifle went flying, clattering across the rocks and coming to rest 10 feet away. "Sarah!" Harrison's voice cut through the chaos, sharp with alarm and something else, genuine concern for her welfare. Sarah rolled behind the stretcher, using it as makeshift cover while she assessed the damage. The bullet had gone clean through her shoulder, missing bone but tearing through muscle and nerve. Her right arm was already going numb, and she could feel blood soaking through her uniform. "I'm okay," she said, though they both knew it was a lie. "Just a flesh wound." Harrison was trying to drag himself toward her fallen rifle, his broken leg leaving a trail of blood in the dirt. "Can you move your arm?" Sarah tried to lift her right arm and immediately regretted it. Lightning bolts of pain shot from her shoulder to her fingertips, and the limb felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. "Not really," she admitted. "Then we're fucked," Harrison said, with the flat certainty of someone who'd just done the tactical math and didn't like the results. "I can't walk, you can't shoot, and there are at least 6 insurgents closing in on our position." Sarah looked at their situation with the cold clarity that sometimes came in moments of absolute crisis. Harrison was right, they were finished. Even if she could reach her rifle, operating it with her left hand while dragging a wounded man across broken terrain was beyond the realm of tactical possibility. But giving up wasn't in Sarah Mitchell's vocabulary. "Harrison, I need you to listen to me very carefully. In about 2 minutes, those fighters are going to be close enough to finish us with grenades or small arms fire. I can't shoot and you can't walk, but there's one thing we can still do." "What's that?" We can make them think we're more dangerous than we actually are. Sarah started pulling grenades from her vest with her good hand. How many of these do you have left? Harrison checked his gear. 3. Why? Because we're going to make them think we've got a machine gun nest up here, Sarah said, pulling the pins from 2 grenades and holding them ready. On my mark, you throw everything you've got at that cluster of rocks where they're massing. I'll hit the positions on the left, make as much noise as possible. Sarah, that's not going to stop them. It might slow them down for 30 seconds, but 30 seconds is all I need, Sarah interrupted. Trust me. Harrison looked at her with something approaching admiration. You're absolutely insane. Probably. Are you ready? Harrison nodded, gripping his grenades despite the pain from his injuries. Ready. Mark. Both soldiers threw their explosives simultaneously, the grenades arcing through the thin mountain air before detonating among the rocks with thunderous roars that echoed off the canyon walls. The explosions sent the insurgent fighters diving for cover, disrupting their advance and buying precious seconds. Sarah used those seconds to do something completely unexpected. Instead of trying to reach her rifle or continue toward the ravine, she grabbed Harrison under the arms and started dragging him directly toward the largest cluster of enemy fighters. Mitchell, what the hell are you doing? Harrison shouted over the ringing in their ears. The one thing they won't expect, Sarah said, pulling him across the rocky ground with her good arm while ignoring the fire spreading through her wounded shoulder. They think we're trying to escape, so we're going to attack instead. It was tactically impossible, strategically impossible, and absolutely the last thing the insurgent fighters would anticipate. For 30 precious seconds, the element of surprise belonged to 2 wounded American soldiers with nothing left to lose. And sometimes, in combat, 30 seconds was enough to change everything. The insurgents had taken cover from their own grenade explosions, expecting return fire from the Americans' last known position. Instead, they found themselves face to face with a wounded corporal dragging her commanding officer directly toward their defensive positions. Sarah reached the first fighting position while the insurgents were still recovering from the blast. The fighter inside was young, maybe 19, with the kind of fierce eyes that spoke of absolute commitment to his cause. He was bringing his AK-47 to bear when Sarah's last grenade, thrown with her left hand from point-blank range, ended the engagement with final authority. The explosion threw both Americans behind a natural rock wall that provided better cover than anything they'd had since the ambush began. Harrison was unconscious again, blood trickling from his nose, but he was breathing steadily. Sarah's shoulder felt like it was on fire, but she could move her fingers now, which meant the nerve damage wasn't permanent. More importantly, the insurgent attack had stalled. The unexpected assault had disrupted their coordination, forced them to reassess the tactical situation, and bought time for Chen and Garcia to reach the extraction point and call for support. Sarah could hear helicopter rotors in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The cavalry was finally coming. But as she looked down at Harrison's unconscious form and felt the blood from her shoulder soaking through her uniform, Sarah realized that their problems were just beginning. They still had to survive long enough for rescue to arrive. They still had to evade the remaining insurgent fighters who would be regrouping for another assault. And they still had to somehow get off this mountain alive. The hardest part wasn't over. It was just beginning. The sound of approaching helicopters grew stronger, but Sarah knew it could just as easily be enemy aircraft as American rescue birds. In this part of Afghanistan, the distinction often meant the difference between salvation and annihilation. She pressed herself against the rock wall, cradling her wounded shoulder while keeping her good hand on Harrison's pulse. Steady but weak, he was alive but barely. Mitchell. Harrison's voice was a whisper, his eyes fluttering open as consciousness returned in fragments. The helicopters, are they ours? Sarah strained to listen over the ringing in her ears left by the grenade explosions. The distinctive whoop 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 was getting closer, and now she could make out the deeper bass notes that suggested heavy rotors. That was either very good news or very bad news. Can't tell yet, she said, checking her remaining ammunition. 3 rounds left in her sidearm, no grenades, and her rifle was somewhere back in the kill zone they'd just escaped. How's your vision? Any double images, nausea? Like I got hit by a freight train, but I can see straight. Harrison tried to shift position and immediately grimaced. My leg's completely useless, though. You're gonna have to carry me the rest of the way. The rest of the way. Sarah looked toward the extraction point, still over a mile through terrain that was probably crawling with insurgent fighters who were now very angry about their disrupted ambush. Even without wounded soldiers to carry, it would be a difficult movement. With Harrison's dead weight and her damaged shoulder, it was approaching the realm of physical impossibility. "Sir, I need to tell you something," Sarah said, watching the ridgelines for movement. "I've been carrying other people's problems since I was 7 years old, but this might be beyond even my capabilities." Harrison studied her face, noting the exhaustion, the pain, the blood that had soaked through her uniform from shoulder to elbow. "Then we'll figure out another way." "What other way? You can't walk, I can barely use one arm, and we've got at least a mile of hostile territory between us and pickup." Before Harrison could answer, the radio crackled to life with Chen's voice, distant and distorted by static. Any station, this is Bravo 27, I have urgent traffic." Sarah keyed her radio with her good hand. "Chen, this is Mitchell, go ahead." "Sarah!" The relief in Chen's voice was palpable. "Thank God. I've got Garcia at the extraction point, and we've got birds inbound. 2 Blackhawks with escort, ETA 6 minutes. But Sarah," his voice grew tense, "the LZ is taking sporadic fire. The insurgents have it under observation, and they're trying to prevent the pickup." Sarah felt her heart sink. Even if they could somehow reach the landing zone, it was apparently compromised. The insurgents had anticipated their extraction plan and moved to counter it. "What's the tactical situation at your position?" she asked. "Garcia's stable but needs immediate medical attention. The helicopter crew is requesting that all personnel move to alternate LZ Bravo. But Sarah, that's 3 miles north of our current position, through terrain that's crawling with hostiles." 3 miles. With Garcia needing medical attention, Chen would have to carry him most of the way, and Sarah would have to carry Harrison through mountain terrain while being hunted by an unknown number of enemy fighters. "Understood," Sarah said into the radio. "Chen, you get Garcia to LZ Bravo. We'll meet you there." "Sarah, negative. You're wounded, Harrison can't walk, and there are insurgents between your position and the alternate LZ. This is tactically impossible." Sarah looked at Harrison, who had been listening to the exchange with growing concern. His green eyes met hers, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something approaching respect there. "Chen," Harrison said, taking the radio from Sarah. "This is Harrison. You will take Garcia to LZ Bravo and ensure his medical evacuation. That's a direct order." "Sir, with respect, I'm not leaving you and Mitchell behind." "You're not leaving us behind, Corporal. You're following orders and completing the mission." Harrison's voice carried the authority of command despite his physical condition. "Mitchell and I will find another way." Another way? Sarah almost laughed at the absurdity of it. They were wounded, surrounded, and facing a movement that would challenge a fully equipped squad in perfect health. But as she looked at Harrison's determined expression, she realized he wasn't giving up. After 8 months of questioning her competence, he was now placing his life entirely in her hands. "Sir," she said quietly, "I need you to understand something. If we attempt to reach LZ Bravo, there's a very good chance we won't make it. The odds are not in our favor." Harrison was quiet for a moment, then smiled, a genuine smile she'd never seen from him before. "Mitchell, 3 hours ago, I would have told you that a corporal with a history of insubordination could never be trusted with critical decisions. Now you've saved my life twice, gotten us out of an impossible tactical situation, and shown more leadership under fire than I've ever demonstrated." He paused, wincing as he tried to shift his position. "If you tell me we can make it to LZ Bravo, I believe you. If you tell me we can't, I believe that too. Either way, I'm trusting your judgment." Sarah stared at him, trying to process this complete reversal in their relationship. The commanding officer who had called her the weak link was now placing absolute faith in her tactical decisions. The truth is, sir, I don't know if we can make it, but I know we can't stay here. The insurgents will regroup and finish what they started. Our only chance is to keep moving and hope we can reach the extraction point before they can coordinate another ambush. Harrison nodded. Then we move. How do you want to do this? Sarah looked around their position, assessing terrain and options. The rock wall that had protected them from the grenade blast extended for about 20 yards, providing concealment but not cover from observation. Beyond that was open ground, then a series of ravines and ridges that offered both opportunities and dangers. "I'm going to have to carry you," she said bluntly. "There's no other way. But sir, you need to understand that this is going to hurt a lot. And if we take contact en route, I might have to drop you and fight. Are you prepared for that?" "Mitchell, I've been prepared to die for my country since I put on this uniform. What I wasn't prepared for was being saved by someone I had completely misjudged." Harrison looked directly at her. "Do what you have to do. I trust you completely." Trust. The word hung between them like a bridge across 8 months of mutual antagonism and professional friction. Sarah had spent those months trying to earn Harrison's respect through competence and dedication. Now, in the space of a few hours, everything has changed. "All right," she said, checking her gear one more time. "I'm going to fashion a better carrying system. This improvised stretcher won't work for long-distance movement." Using Harrison's equipment and her own, Sarah created a makeshift backpack-style carrier that would distribute his weight more evenly across her shoulders. It wasn't comfortable, and it certainly wasn't designed for someone with a bullet wound, but it was functional. "This is going to be interesting," Harrison said, as Sarah helped him into the carrier. "How much do I weigh?" "Right now, about 1,000 pounds." Sarah gritted her teeth as she took his full weight on her injured shoulder. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but manageable. Barely. "Are you sure about this?" "No," Sarah admitted, "but I'm sure about the alternative." They started moving, Sarah carrying Harrison piggyback style while using her good arm to steady herself against rocks and navigate the treacherous terrain. Every step sent lightning bolts of pain through her wounded shoulder, but she'd learned long ago that pain was just information, useful to acknowledge, but not necessarily actionable. The first quarter mile was the hardest. Sarah's body had to adjust to the additional weight, and she had to learn how to balance Harrison's bulk while maintaining tactical awareness of their surroundings. Several times she nearly fell, catching herself at the last second and earning concerned questions from Harrison that she ignored in favor of concentrating on movement. "Mitchell," Harrison said quietly as they paused behind a cluster of boulders, "are you okay? You're breathing pretty hard." Sarah was breathing hard because she was carrying a 180-pound man across mountain terrain with a bullet wound in her shoulder. But admitting weakness wasn't going to help either of them reach the extraction point. "I'm fine," she said, though they both knew it was a lie. "How's your head? Any dizziness or disorientation?" "Clear as a bell." "But Sarah," Harrison's voice grew serious, "I need to say something while I have the chance." "Save your strength, sir. We've got a long way to go." "No, I need to say this now." Harrison shifted his weight, trying to make himself easier to carry. "I've been wrong about you from the beginning. Not just wrong, completely, fundamentally wrong. I thought leadership meant giving orders and expecting compliance. You've shown me that real leadership means taking responsibility for people who trust you with their lives." Sarah continued moving, using the conversation to distract herself from the growing fire in her shoulder. "Sir, we can discuss leadership philosophy when we're safely back at base." "We might not make it back to base," Harrison said quietly. "And if we don't, I want you to know that serving with you has been an honor, even when I was too stupid to recognize it." Sarah stopped walking and turned her head to look at him. "Harrison, we're both going to make it back to base. We're going to have that conversation about leadership, and you're going to have the chance to apply what you've learned to future missions. That's not optimism talking. That's tactical assessment based on available options and probable outcomes. Harrison smiled. Is that your way of telling me to shut up and let you concentrate on me? That's exactly what that is. They resumed movement, and Sarah focused on the rhythm of walking, the careful placement of each foot, the constant assessment of terrain and threats. This was what she'd been trained for, what she'd been preparing for through 2 deployments and countless hours of physical conditioning. This was the moment when all that preparation either proved sufficient or didn't. Behind them, she could hear the distant sound of small arms fire as Chen and Garcia made their own movement toward LZ Bravo. Ahead, the terrain grew more challenging, with steep slopes and narrow passages that would test her strength and endurance to their limits. But Sarah Mitchell had been carrying heavy loads her entire life. Today was just another load, another responsibility, another person depending on her to get the job done. The difference was that this time, the person she was carrying finally understood why she was strong enough to carry him. 2 miles to go, she said, more to herself than to Harrison. I know you can do it. For the first time in 8 months, Sarah believed he meant it. The mountain seemed determined to kill them through sheer exhaustion. Sarah had been carrying Harrison for over an hour, and every muscle in her body screamed in protest with each step. Her wounded shoulder had progressed from sharp pain to a dull, throbbing agony that radiated down her entire right side. Sweat poured into her eyes despite the cool mountain air, and her breathing had become labored to the point where conversation was impossible. But she kept moving. The terrain had grown increasingly treacherous as they climbed higher into the Hindu Kush range. What had started as rocky but manageable ground had evolved into near vertical slopes where one misplaced step could send them both tumbling hundreds of feet down granite cliff faces. Sarah found herself moving from handhold to handhold, using her good arm to pull both their weights up sections that would have challenged a rock climber without equipment. Sarah, stop. Harrison's voice was tight with concern. You need to rest. You're going to collapse if you don't take a break. Sarah paused at a narrow ledge, barely wide enough for both of them, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Looking back the way they'd come, she could see smoke rising from multiple locations across the valley, evidence of ongoing combat as various forces maneuvered for tactical advantage. Can't stop, she gasped between breaths. Every minute we're stationary is another minute for them to track our movement and set up another ambush. And every minute you push yourself beyond human limits is another minute closer to complete physical breakdown, Harrison countered. Sarah, I can feel you shaking. Your body is running on adrenaline and willpower, but that's not sustainable over this distance. Sarah knew he was right. Her legs felt like water, her vision was starting to blur around the edges, and she could feel her grip strength failing. But stopping meant dying, and dying meant Harrison would never see his family again. Chen and Garcia might not reach the extraction point, and Thompson's sacrifice would have been meaningless. Just need to keep moving, she said, adjusting Harrison's position on her back and preparing to continue up the slope. Mitchell. Harrison's voice carried a note of command that made her pause. I need you to listen to me as your commanding officer and as someone who has come to respect your judgment more than anyone else's in this unit. Sarah turned her head to look at him, seeing something in his green eyes that she'd never seen before, genuine concern for her welfare rather than mission success. You've carried me further than should have been possible, Harrison continued. You've shown courage, endurance, and tactical brilliance that would be remarkable under normal circumstances and is absolutely extraordinary given our situation. But Sarah, you're human, and humans have limits. I don't, Sarah said simply. I can't afford to have limits, not when people are depending on me. Harrison was quiet for a moment, studying her face. When did you first decide that everyone else's welfare was more important than your own? The question caught Sarah off guard. She'd never really thought about it as a conscious decision. It had just been the natural order of things for as long as she could remember. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe when my dad left. Maybe when I realized that if I didn't take care of my sister, no one else would. Maybe the first time I saw a soldier trust me to bring them home safely. And when do you get to stop carrying everyone else's weight? Sarah considered the question seriously. I guess when everyone's safe. And what if everyone's never safe? What if there's always another person who needs help, another crisis that requires your intervention, another situation where your strength is the difference between life and death? Sarah started moving again, partly to avoid the uncomfortable direction of the conversation, and partly because staying still felt like giving up. Then I guess I'll keep carrying the weight, even if it kills you, especially if it kills me. Harrison fell silent, and Sarah could feel him thinking as they climbed. The path ahead was becoming even more challenging, with loose shale that threatened to give way under their combined weight and exposure to observation from multiple directions. But they were making progress toward LZ Bravo, and progress meant hope. "Sarah," Harrison said finally, "I need to tell you about my father. Sir, you should conserve your energy. My father was a Marine colonel," Harrison continued. 3 tours in Vietnam, decorated for valor, everything the Corps could offer. He raised me to believe that leadership meant making hard decisions, that sometimes you had to sacrifice individuals for the greater good of the mission. Sarah navigated around a particularly treacherous section of loose rock, her boots scrambling for purchase on the granite slope. Sounds like solid military doctrine. It is solid military doctrine. It's also complete bullshit when applied to actual human beings. Harrison's voice carried a note of pain that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. My father never understood that the mission is successful only when the people executing it come home alive. He measured success in terms of objectives achieved, not lives preserved. "Harrison, this really isn't the time." "This is exactly the time," Harrison interrupted, "because 3 hours ago I was my father. I was so focused on completing the mission, on proving my tactical competence, on following the textbook, that I lost sight of the fundamental truth you've been trying to show me." Sarah paused at another ledge, this one offering a clear view of the valley below. In the distance, she could see dust clouds that might have been vehicle movement, either reinforcements or additional enemy forces responding to the ongoing engagement. "What truth is that?" she asked, more to keep Harrison talking than out of genuine curiosity. Conversation helped distract from the pain and exhaustion. "That leadership isn't about being in charge. It's about being responsible. And responsibility means understanding that every decision you make affects real people, with families and dreams that matter more than any tactical objective." Sarah resumed climbing, but Harrison's words stayed with her. For 8 months, she'd assumed that Harrison's criticism of her methods was based on genuine tactical disagreement. Now she was beginning to understand that it had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what military service actually meant. "You changed my mind about a lot of things today," Harrison said, as they approached what looked like the most challenging section of their route, a near vertical rock face that stretched 30 feet above them. Sarah studied the cliff face, looking for handholds and trying to calculate whether she had enough strength left to climb while carrying Harrison's weight. It was going to be close. "Sir, I'm going to need you to help me with this next section. Can you use your arms to hold on to the rock face while I climb?" "Absolutely. But Sarah, before we do this, I need you to know something." "What's that?" "When we get back to base, I'm recommending you for promotion to sergeant and for transfer to a leadership position where your abilities will be properly utilized. You should be commanding troops, not serving under officers too stupid to recognize exceptional talent." Sarah looked up at the cliff face, then back at Harrison. "Are you sure about that? I still have a history of insubordination." Harrison smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his entire face. "I've learned the difference between insubordination and independent thinking. What I called insubordination was actually superior tactical judgment that I was too arrogant to recognize. And if I continue to question orders that I think are tactically unsound, then I'll expect you to have good reasons for your concerns, and I'll listen to those reasons instead of dismissing them out of hand." Harrison's expression grew serious. "Sarah, I want officers under my command who think independently, who question assumptions, who care more about keeping soldiers alive than about following orders blindly. Officers like you. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a weight she'd been carrying without realizing it suddenly becoming lighter. For 8 months, she'd been fighting against a commanding officer who she'd thought was incompetent. Now she realized she'd been fighting against someone who simply needed to learn the same lessons she'd learned, but from a different starting point. "All right," she said, positioning herself for the climb. "Let's see if we can both live long enough for you to make good on those promises." The climb up the rock face was the most physically demanding thing Sarah had ever attempted. With Harrison clinging to her back and using his arms to help maintain their balance, she pulled both their weights up the granite cliff using finger holds that were barely adequate for one person, let alone two. Halfway up, her strength nearly gave out completely. Her wounded shoulder sent lightning bolts of agony through her entire body. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, and for a moment she genuinely thought they were going to fall. But Harrison's voice in her ear, steady and encouraging, helped her find reserves of strength she didn't know existed. "You've got this, Sarah. Just a few more feet. I can see the top." "Easy for you to say," Sarah grunted, reaching for the next handhold. "You're not the one doing the climbing." "No, but I'm the one with the best view of your incredible determination. Keep going." They reached the top of the cliff just as Sarah's strength completely gave out. She collapsed onto the flat ground, Harrison rolling off her back and landing beside her with a grunt of pain. For several minutes, both soldiers lay motionless, breathing heavily and letting their bodies recover from the extreme physical effort. "How much further?" Sarah asked when she could finally speak. Harrison checked their position against the map and landmarks. "Maybe half a mile. But Sarah, that's through the most exposed terrain we've encountered yet. If there are insurgents watching the alternate LZ, they'll see us coming from a long way off." Sarah forced herself to sit up, assessing their tactical situation. Harrison was right. The terrain ahead offered excellent fields of observation for anyone positioned correctly. They'd be visible for at least 10 minutes before reaching the landing zone, plenty of time for enemies to coordinate an attack. "Then we'll have to be fast," she said, helping Harrison back into the carrying position. "Sarah," Harrison said as she prepared to lift him again, "are you sure you can do this? The last section nearly killed you, and this is going to be even more demanding." Sarah looked ahead at the exposed ground they'd have to cross, then back at Harrison's concerned face. "Harrison, I've been carrying other people's burdens my entire life. Today is just the most literal example." "But what if?" "No what ifs," Sarah interrupted, getting to her feet and feeling Harrison's weight settle across her shoulders once again. "We're going to reach that LZ. We're going to get on that helicopter, and we're both going to go home. That's not hope talking, that's a promise." Harrison was quiet for a moment. "I believe you," he said finally. "Good," Sarah replied, starting across the exposed ground toward LZ Bravo. Behind them, the sound of distant gunfire suggested that the battle for the valley was still ongoing. Ahead, the promise of extraction and safety waited at a landing zone that might or might not be secure. But for the first time since the ambush began, Sarah Mitchell felt like they might actually make it home alive. The sound of helicopter rotors grew stronger as Sarah crested the final ridge overlooking LZ Bravo. Below them, she could see 2 Black Hawk helicopters sitting on a relatively flat section of mountain terrain, their rotors spinning, ready for immediate departure. Chen was there, kneeling beside Garcia, who was strapped to a medical stretcher, while the flight medic worked frantically over the wounded soldier's body. They'd made it, against all odds, through 8 miles of hostile territory while carrying a wounded commanding officer. Sarah Mitchell had delivered on her promise. But their problems weren't over yet. "Contact east," Chen's voice crackled through the radio as muzzle flashes began winking from the ridgeline overlooking the landing zone. The insurgents had found them, and they were making one last attempt to prevent the American extraction. Sarah felt Harrison's weight shift on her back as he brought his sidearm to bear, returning fire despite his injuries. "Sarah, we need to move now. They're trying to pin down the helicopters." Sarah started running down the slope toward the landing zone, her legs nearly giving out with each step, but somehow finding the strength to keep moving. Bullets cracked past their heads, kicked up dirt around their feet, but the helicopter gun gunners were laying down suppressing fire that forced the insurgents to keep their heads down. 50 yards, Harrison shouted over the rotor noise. We're going to make it. 30, 20. Sarah could see the helicopter crew chief waving them forward, could see Chen helping to load Garcia into the aircraft. The flight medic was already preparing a stretcher for Harrison, understanding without being told that he wasn't walking away from this. 10 yards from the helicopter, Sarah's strength finally gave out completely. She stumbled, fell to her knees, and felt Harrison roll off her back onto the rocky ground. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything except kneel there with her hands pressed against the ground while her body shook with exhaustion. "Sarah!" Chen appeared beside her, helping her to her feet while the helicopter crew lifted Harrison onto a medical stretcher. "Come on, we need to go now." Sarah forced herself upright and stumbled toward the helicopter, Chen supporting her weight as they covered the final few yards. Behind them, insurgent fire was intensifying, and she could hear the distinctive whistle of incoming RPG rounds. The helicopter lifted off just as the first rocket-propelled grenade exploded where they'd been standing seconds earlier. Sarah collapsed onto the floor of the aircraft, finally allowing herself to believe that they were going to survive. "Garcia?" she asked the flight medic, who was working over both wounded soldiers with professional efficiency. "Stable. He's going to need surgery, but he'll be fine. Your commander here has a concussion and a fractured leg, but nothing life-threatening." The medic looked at Sarah's shoulder wound. "What about you? That's a lot of blood." "I'm fine," Sarah said automatically, then caught Harrison's eye. He was watching her with an expression of amazement and something that might have been gratitude. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely audible over the helicopter noise, "you carried me 8 miles through enemy territory with a bullet wound in your shoulder." 7.3 miles, Sarah corrected. "I measured it on the GPS." Harrison started laughing, a sound that seemed to surprise him as much as anyone else. 7.3 miles. Of course you measured it. Chen was looking back and forth between them with confusion. "Sir, did you just call her Sarah? Since when do you use first names?" "Since I learned the difference between a weak link and the strongest person I've ever served with." "Harrison, your corporal here just saved our entire squad through a combination of tactical brilliance, physical courage, and sheer stubborn determination." "I know that, sir. I've been trying to tell you that for 8 months." Harrison's expression grew serious. "I know you have, and I should have listened." The helicopter flight to the forward medical facility took 20 minutes, during which Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness while medics worked on her shoulder wound. She was dimly aware of radio traffic, of landing, of being transferred to a hospital bed, but everything felt distant and unreal after the immediate intensity of combat. When she woke up 12 hours later, her shoulder was wrapped in professional bandages, her arm was in a sling, and she felt like she'd been run over by a tank. The first thing she saw was Chen sitting in a chair beside her bed, reading a paperback novel. "Hey there, hero," he said, closing the book. "How do you feel?" "Like I carried someone 8 miles through the mountains," Sarah said, trying to sit up and immediately regretting it. "Garcia?" "Full recovery expected. They removed some shrapnel from his shoulder and patched up the side wound, but he'll be fine. He's already asking when he can write to his mother and tell her the truth about where he's been stationed." Sarah smiled, despite the pain. "And Harrison?" "Broken leg, mild concussion, various cuts and bruises. But he's been asking about you every hour since we got here." Chen's expression grew serious. "Sarah, he's been talking to the colonel about what happened out there, about your actions, about his tactical decisions, about how the whole engagement went down." Sarah felt a familiar weight settle in her stock. "Am I in trouble?" "The opposite," Chen smiled. "He's recommending you for the Silver Star and immediate promotion to sergeant. He's also requested that you be transferred to a leadership position where your skills will be properly utilized." The Silver Star. Sarah had seen exactly 2 of those awarded in her 5 years of service, both to soldiers who had performed acts of valor that bordered on the superhuman. Chen, I just did what anyone would have done. No, you didn't. Most people would have followed orders and gotten everyone killed. Most people would have left Harrison to figure out his own problems after the way he treated you. Most people don't carry wounded soldiers 8 miles through hostile territory because it's the right thing to do. Before Sarah could respond, the door opened and Harrison walked in on crutches, his left leg in a cast, his head wrapped in bandages, but his expression more relaxed than she'd ever seen it. "Mitchell," he said, settling into another chair with obvious discomfort. "How are you feeling?" "Fine, sir. Ready to return to duty." Harrison raised an eyebrow. "According to the medical staff, you've got muscle damage in your shoulder that's going to keep you on light duty for at least 3 weeks. But that's not why I'm here." He looked directly at her, his green eyes serious but warm. "I'm here because I owe you an apology that's about 8 months overdue. I've been wrong about you from the beginning, and my poor judgment nearly got good soldiers killed. Sir, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do." Harrison's voice carried a note of urgency. "Sarah, what you did out there wasn't just heroic. It was a masterclass in leadership under impossible circumstances. You made tactical decisions that saved lives. You showed physical courage that inspired everyone around you, and you demonstrated the kind of loyalty that makes soldiers willing to follow leaders into hell itself." Sarah looked at Chen, who was grinning, then back at Harrison. "Thank you, sir. I've also been talking to Colonel Martinez about your future. You're being promoted to sergeant effective immediately, and you're being transferred to the infantry school as a leadership instructor. Your job will be teaching other soldiers what you showed me. That real leadership isn't about giving orders, it's about taking care of people." Sarah felt tears starting to sting her eyes, though whether from relief or exhaustion or simple overwhelming emotion, she couldn't say. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll accept the position. Say you'll help train the next generation of soldiers to understand what you understand about responsibility and service and carrying the weight that matters most." Sarah looked at these 2 men, Chen, who had been her anchor through months of difficult leadership, and Harrison, who had transformed from antagonist to ally through the crucible of shared adversity. She thought about Thompson, who had died trying to save his teammate, and Garcia, who would go home to tell his mother the truth about where he'd been. She thought about all the young soldiers who would pass through her training program, all the people she could teach to carry their responsibilities with honor and competence and genuine care for the people under their command. "I accept," she said. Harrison smiled. "Outstanding. And Sarah?" "Yes, sir. Thank you for carrying me home." 3 months later, Sarah stood in front of her first class of new infantry students, watching young faces that reminded her of Garcia and Thompson and all the soldiers who trusted their leaders to make the right decisions when everything was falling apart. "Leadership," she said, "isn't about being in charge. It's about being responsible. It's about understanding that the people under your command aren't just soldiers. They're someone's son, someone's daughter, someone's hope for the future." She paused, looking at each face in turn. "And sometimes being responsible means carrying weights that seem impossible to carry. But here's what I've learned. When you're carrying someone else's burden, you're never carrying it alone." Sarah Mitchell had been carrying other people's burdens her entire life. Now, finally, she was teaching others to help her carry them. The weight was still there. It always would be. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't carrying it alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.